But if you were Putin and you knew that I'm Zelensky, I'm struggling for weapons, and they're probably not going to arrive for months, maybe a year, the risk is you start to smell blood. And you start to go, I'm going to take a degree of risk now, and I'm just going to push forward and accept massive casualties because I know that Ukraine will struggle to withstand that assault.
So here is some chit-chat following a US House Intelligence Committee. Some of the people there got a bit worried, and we're now learning some news that Russia apparently is putting nuclear weapons into space. Is this American posturing? Are there political motives? What's going on?
It's an odd story, isn't it? Because, this committee, they came out from what's described as at least a secret, probably top secret briefing that they can't talk about. They were so worried about what they heard that they said that there were some serious national security concerns and that President Biden needed to declassify some of this program. And you went, what program? It turns out they were had been briefed on the potential for Russia to put nuclear weapons in space to threaten the US satellite constellation, and therefore, satellites provide so much that we rely on these days that it would be a serious vulnerability if they were to do that. It's also the fact that the Russians are signatories to the Outer Space Treaty, which sounds a bit Star Warsy, doesn't it? But it was signed in 1967, and it bans any form of orbital nuclear weapons. And it's also, of course, it's all linked to this weaponization of space. Everybody's massively concerned.
And as we know, Putin's very good with those sort of agreements, isn't he?
Well, we've seen over the last few years, haven't we? He tends to tear them up. I think what's fascinating to get behind this, because I initially, when I heard the story, went, putting nuclear weapons on the top of rockets. We've just recently had a couple of rocket launches into space that have failed, and where would that leave us if nuclear weapons go off? Why wouldn't Russia want to put nuclear weapon in space? Because there's other ways of. From my time in the military, I was aware that one of the biggest threats was not exploding a nuclear weapon in space, but because actually it has a lot of serious implications. Do you know the last time I think that a country put a weapon into space and exploded it?
A nuclear weapon?
Nuclear weapon.
No.
Yeah, so it was back in the 1960s. It was a program called Starfish Prime, which the US, I think it was 3 or 4 nuclear weapons they put into space to see the effects it would have. Back in the 1960s, the year I was born, in fact. But there were unintended consequences of that. They didn't fully understand what was going to happen. And it turned out that at the time, 1960s, there weren't many satellites in orbit. The Brits lost 3 satellites to that explosion. So it had all sorts of consequences.
And the debris after it as well.
Well, exactly.
Damage.
So it's a really indiscriminate weapon. And Russia is also very heavily dependent on satellites. And actually a much easier way of taking out the satellite constellation is literally to launch a load of sand into space, explode sand in low Earth orbit. And there's no risk if the rocket blows up on launch. But little particles of sand travelling at tens of thousands of miles an hour will destroy satellites. So that would be a much safer...
Everybody's satellites.
Everybody's satellites. So if that's what you wanted to do, why would you put a nuclear weapon? And actually what's interesting, I think, to try and get behind this story...
So is this actually Russia doing this, or is there something else going on in the
I
US?
think there's something else going on. And part of that is... I'm old enough, and you are certainly old enough to remember the...
Thank you.
Yes, my pleasure.
Well, I've just learned a couple of things today. Well, obviously the Russian weapons into space. Also, you're a lot younger than I thought you were, Sean. Born
It's
in
not
the 60s.
the years, it's the mileage. Just remember that. But no, going back to the topic, back in '83, Reagan, you might remember the Star Wars Initiative.
I actually do.
Yeah, SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. And at the time, America was experimenting with lasers in space to take out missiles and enemy satellites. And then it all went quiet. 40 years ago that happened. Do you think that the Americas stopped developing any capability at that time?
No.
I don't think so
Under
either.
the cover, yeah.
But it will be covert programs that are secret, top secret, or well above. How do you get funding for programs like that when they are top secret?
Scare the EBGBs out of everybody.
Yeah. by creating a potential threat. I'm not saying it's not a real one, but creating a potential threat, senators get all excited, and now you attract funding. And we're on the eve of a presidential election. It's all about spending priorities. And I think what's fascinating, if you look at, again, I remember the first moon landings, all black and white, because it was 50 odd years ago, wasn't it? Actually, since the 60s, there's been very little. US pioneered the space travel, and since about 63, 64, largely went a bit quiet. And if you look at who's landed on the moon in the last few years, it's not just America, it's all sorts of other nations. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if actually this is part of the political figures in the US going, we've taken our eye off the ball here. Are we prepared to let ourselves slip back in terms of our role in space?
Well, you've only got to say the word nuclear and everybody gets excited. So it's a good way to turn the heat up. So maybe we're going to be looking to you, as with some other topics, to keep us up to date, Sean.
Well, but I think this is a really interesting one, because even Putin turned around and said this is a shameless effort to attract more funding for a program. Now, you can never trust what Putin is saying or whatever, but really putting a nuclear weapon on the top of a big missile and orbit that in space, I just don't see how that makes sense. And it's very difficult to see how it does. There has to be something more to it. And I think it'll be interesting for our viewers just to work out what do they think is going on here. What have the Americans got in space? What sort of capability is there? And how do you continue to develop it?
So Putin has mounted a major campaign against Avdiivka, been bombing the hell out of it, and in the end it fell. What's actually the position today, Sean?
Well, it's big news, hasn't it? Because I think largely because Russia's been on the back foot for the last year. We were talking a lot about the spring offensive from last year. Didn't start till late, but all the anticipation was about Ukraine being on the front foot, and Russia has been therefore on the back foot. Yet for the last 4 months, Russian forces have been pounding away at this small, it's called a city, it's about 30,000 strong, but it's actually relatively small. And even the Russian Air Force has been involved, which we've not really seen it involve much to date, largely probably because Avdiivka is not that far away from the Russian border, and therefore the Russian Air Force can still hide in the sanctuary of Russian airspace. But we heard earlier this week that finally the Ukrainian forces withdrew, largely because there was a sort of pincer movement around the outside that was gradually going to isolate the Ukrainian forces, and they could have lost some of their most experienced battle-hardened soldiers. So it seemed to make sense they came out. The Russian forces massively overmatched those in Ukraine. There were talk about 10-1, i.e. 10 times as many Russian forces as there were Ukrainians. And even though it's winter, and I know that's obvious, but it's minus loads out there. It's festeringly cold. There's no ground cover, there's no leaves, there's no bushes, so it's quite difficult to get cover, and you can't dig trenches very easily because the ground is frozen. So by all accounts, Russia paid a huge price in terms of casualties for seizing that city.
And is it strategic in any way, or is it sending big news back home? I mean, why for such what apparently might seem so small, why put so much effort into it?
Yeah, so either it's, a breakthrough point, like sort of a crack in a dam, you push that and suddenly you push a load of Russian forces further in, deeper into Ukraine. I think that was one of the worries. Most Western analysts, including, I think, some very well-informed sources, including the Institute of Studies for War and others, say neither Russia nor Ukraine have got the resources at the moment to do any really big muscle movements on the battlefields anytime soon. So the question is why? And part of that does seem to be because Russia's been on the back foot. The 2-year anniversary of the invasion comes up on this weekend on Saturday. So about the time this podcast will go out. And so a moral component of this to give Russian forces a boost, but also it's the Russian presidential elections coming up. Why does it matter? Putin will get elected anyway. Well, it probably does matter because there's a lot of bad news that will be coming out, huge number of casualties, not much sign of progress. Whereas now, Putin has been lauding the fact that he's had a victory. General Gerasimov has been seen handing out medals. That's the head of the Russian military. So it's undoubtedly really, really key. And I think it puts Ukraine in a very difficult position in terms of next steps, because it's lost a bit of momentum. It's lost a key city. And the question is really, which has been resonating around the West, is that because Russia was just wanted it so badly and was prepared to pay whatever it cost, or was it the lack of support by the West for Ukraine, running out of weapons, having no choice but to withdraw?
So Avdiivka has fallen at great cost to Russia, but Putin gets to carry some news back home and look good in front of his people on the state-controlled media. Not a great day for Zelensky, and he will be running around amongst his allies trying to raise money. I guess the big question is, if they gave him all the money in the world, can he translate that into the weaponry he needs to carry on fighting the war?
Yeah, what's been interesting over the last week is Zelensky's been on a whistle-stop tour again, as he does, trying to unlock the US funding. It's blocked in Congress, $60 billion, big numbers of aid. That's become a bit of a political football. And undoubtedly, Zelensky and Biden have both been saying, look, this blockage is the cause for losing Avdiivka. If you don't unlock it, things will get worse. The problem is, if you actually strip behind this story, I get the whole politics of it, but the EU has recently unlocked a similar amount of money for the next year or so. So money isn't necessarily the issue. The issue is weapons. The issue is not even weapons. It's weapons in the hands of the soldiers on the front line being used today. And if we unwrap that, just because you unlock the money, how do you get those weapons swiftly? Now, some of the weapons, for example, dumb weapons like artillery shells, the West has been trying to source those, and they haven't managed to deliver the numbers that Putin's getting from North Korea, for example, but it is gradually unlocking. The problem with that sort of weapon is it's a dumb weapon. You use dumb artillery shells in a war of attrition. That's the one war that Ukraine has to avoid at all costs, because a war of attrition generally favours the bigger military, and Russia is bigger. The advantage that the West has given to Ukraine is high-tech, precision strike weapons. That's what's made the difference. But they've come out of war stocks, our own inventories, so it's relatively quick to give them.
And also, as we were covering on a previous podcast, that it's given the West an opportunity to replenish, in the sense that they're getting rid of old stock, which actually might be old technology, because they don't particularly want to expose the new technology to what might be, one of their greatest enemies in the future. I know, I think it was Poland, in revamping their entire defence structure, were giving some of the old stuff to Ukraine, which is fine. But obviously there comes a point when that runs out, and then you've got to spin up new development, which may not be that easy.
You're absolutely right. So Storm Shadow for the Brits, 30-year-old missiles, proved very effective at schwacking a number of Russian targets, but we don't have that many of them. And as you say, our replacement missiles, we don't want to give them... Technology is our asymmetric advantage. It's the one advantage we have over Russia. So would we now give Ukraine our state-of-the-art weapons when some of those weapons are likely to go into the black market and therefore could well fall into the hands of Russia or China?
You mean black market in the sense that in the journey from America to Ukraine, there's somewhere some of them get diverted?
Yeah, because we can't keep absolute track of this stuff. It is a war zone. There's lots of uncertainty. Money changes hands. And therefore, we're not that worried if the older weapons go into their hands. So the real answer is, so you can't replace the weapons. The money comes in. What do we do with it? We haven't got weapons in the weapon stock. We can't give them the most modern weapons. So you go to industry and say, right, we need to spin up our defence industrial base. So one of the arguments has been, we're 10 times the size collectively of Russia. Put our minds to it, we can do this. Yeah, but Russia is doing it. They are spinning up their factories using oil revenue to fund spending exorbitant amounts of money from their GDP on defence. what are we doing? And you know only too well, working in industry, how long does it take? I come to you and say, right, I'd like you to invent a new missile. I need you to be able to do this, this, and this.
Yeah, come back in 10 years.
Yeah. I mean, it's not going to happen next week, is it?
No.
And that's the problem, is that unless we find a way to ramp this up. Now, if it's true that both Russia and Ukraine are going to have to lick their wounds for a while, it's quite possible there'll be some sort of frozen front line for a good proportion of this year. But if you were Putin and you knew that I'm Zelensky, I'm struggling for weapons, and they're probably not going to arrive for months, maybe a year, the risk is you start to smell blood. And you start to go, I'm going to take a degree of risk now, and I'm just going to push forward and accept massive casualties, because I know that Ukraine will struggle to withstand that assault. And that's the worry at the moment, is that there's no evidence that the West has solved this problem of generating these high-tech precision strike weapons, but dumb enough that we're prepared to sell them in sufficient numbers and in sufficient time to make a difference. So it's all very well talking about the money being unlocked in Congress. Yes, when that aid is unlocked, there'll be some of the weapons can come out of Western US inventories. But they're huge, but they'll be struggling with the same challenge.
Yeah, and the other thing is we know that actually 60 billion sounds a lot of money, but 60 billion actually does not last very long.
No, because it's not just the weapons. You've got to be paying the soldiers on the ground. You've got to
Everything.
It doesn't go very far. But no, it's as much about the weapons today as it is about the money. So that's the key.
So the Wagner group in Russia hit notoriety a little while ago. What was meant to be a march for justice actually turned out to be the makings of a military coup. The leader mysteriously died in a plane crash, and the group was then dismantled. But it turns out other things were going on and are going on still. Can you tell us something about the development, Sean?
It's a fascinating story, I think, because as you say, from the Western perspective, it was the rise of Wagner and the fall, and that's it. There's so much more to it. I mean, Wagner was a private military company, organization run by Yevgeny Prigozhin, an old friend of Vladimir Putin. Came to prominence in sort of 2014, 2015 in the Donbass, grew and grew until by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Wagner group had a big part to play, and it sort of culminated around the Bakhmut. Remember the fight for Bakhmut? 50,000 allegedly Russian conscripts that were all underneath the Wagner group doing the majority of the frontline fighting there. And at one stage, Yevgeny Prigozhin was the most powerful and most feared mercenary in the world, running a multi-billion operation with a load of fighters. What's interesting as well, before, I think it was September 22, Putin denied it was anything to do with the Russian state. In fact, he famously told the French President Macron that it was nothing to do with Russia. After around September 22, he admitted it was funded by Russia. But by, as you say, June in 23, Prigozhin did this march for freedom. He'd just become too powerful. And then on the 23rd of August last year, aircraft crash, farewell, Prigozhin.
So the group is a mercenary group. In other words, they're up for hire. So
yes,
you pay them to go and
so that part of the business, which was the part where guns for hire, recruit, go and fight on behalf of Russia. But as it turns out, so in that part was gradually dismantled. Putin did not want something that powerful to rise against him again. So there's been lots of ways that the fighters have been dealt with, either been assimilated into the army, got rid of, deployed to other parts of the organization. But Wagner wasn't only doing that. They were also providing mercenary services to countries around the world. In other words, where there were regimes in place, they would help keep those regimes in power. And in return for that, they would take mineral rights, for example, gold or jewelry, or the like.
So
And
this is the stuff of Hollywood, isn't it?
it is, but it used to be, I mean, remember, America used to destabilize countries. There's been films with Tom Cruise in about this stuff, where it used to be destabilizing countries. What seems to have changed, though, is that now that Putin admits backing this, Russia's out of the shadows with this. Now, one of the things they've been offering is a regime survival package. What the hell is that? Well, part of it is very attractive to a regime, and this has become a multi-billion-dollar operation.
I believe it. Yeah.
Putin apparently has taken $2 billion in gold out of Africa just in the last 2 years alone, and it's been dubbed Vagner 2.0. It's a sort of rebranded Vagner group. And let's give an example of how this is. So the minerals, why are they valuable? So in Niger, which is one of the countries that they operate, there are uranium mines. Why are they important? France has 56 reactors, nuclear reactors. 2/3 of its energy comes from nuclear power, and a fifth of its uranium comes from these mines in Niger. So if Putin's mercenary group, Wagner 2, starts controlling those mines, then it has the opportunity to commit energy blackmail. And that's where it becomes fascinating. There are 3 countries, I think it's Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, which are all about grouped together. Each of those countries has recently undergone a military coup. Now, in the past, the military coup would take over, but would be forced by the population to go back to democracy or at least some sort of elected government. Whereas if you now call Wagner, they will come in, keep you in power, providing you let them have the rights to some of the minerals.
So this is quite dangerous, potentially.
I think it's hugely dangerous.
If they control resources that are key or fundamental to our nation state in the UK or in the US, then we're dependent on people who are possibly our enemies. So in the situation you've described, uranium and maybe other minerals which are essential for our energy, not just uranium, then what it behoves us to do is at least become energy independent, which in the UK we are not at the moment. Of our own making, we're not energy independent, and therefore we're reliant on other countries.
But even if we become energy independent, I think it's a fascinating discussion, because battery technology, which is part of that, requires lithium, requires a whole lot of other elements.
Yeah,
they all come from mines, they all come from parts of the world, and there's a lot of push to try and control them. I think the other worry is that we, in the past, have done business. We in the West do business with African states. We buy the resources, that puts wealth into the country, and we believe that's all part of supporting a democratic process, freedom. But if actually there's a mercenary group going in there supporting a military coup, and they now control those mineral resources, that is very worrying, because it distorts the market. And actually, do we not buy from them? Or do we buy from them and actually we're simply supporting Wagner and therefore Russia?
Well, that's one thing. Is that where we want to put our money? Because that money then goes into a regime that maybe we're not very happy with. But the other thing is, once you become dependent from an energy or key, fundamental minerals point of view, very hard to become independent overnight. It takes a long time. And my worry here, Sean, is what's happened over the last couple of years, and we're now seeing it in the Middle East, because it's not just Hamas, it's actually a big nation state, powerful nation called Iran. What I think's happened, the battle lines are being much more clearly drawn and defined. So it's a lot easier for us to now know who our enemies or who our future enemies might be. From an energy point of view, or a key mineral resource point of view, I would say we do not want to be dependent on those, which means, do we then voluntarily trade with those nations today? I mean, whatever the answer is, it must be a big issue for UK government, US government, and so on.
And I think this is definitely something we're going to explore, isn't it? I think in the weeks ahead, because it's a broader defence issue. Because yes, what has the uranium got to do with defence? Well, it's got everything to do with defence. Because once once you have energy blackmail happening, we had that with at the start of the war when Ukraine was attacked by Russia. Remember the gas pipeline that was exploded? All of a sudden, massive concerns about the supply of gas from Russia, and that caused massive shock waves through our system, caused massive inflation, energy shocks, and the like. We are so heavily dependent these days on international trade, and particularly around some of these technology and minerals. There's not a lot of them about. They are limited resource. And if we don't control some of them, or we simply rely on the free market, that leaves us vulnerable, very vulnerable.
If you don't get your energy, forget it. Game over.
We've been doing this podcast now for a few months, and one of the things we were determined to do was to make sure it resonated with our viewers and get you involved in the process. We're looking at defence-wide. It's not just about the wars in Ukraine and with Hamas and Israel. What we're trying to do is look at defence matters more broadly, and we want your questions. So pop the questions into the comments section, and we will try to do our best to answer those on a weekly basis. We have got a question from Catherine this week.
So Catherine, thank you for your question. Sean, what Catherine wanted to know, she was curious about the Israeli Iron Dome system, and she really had two questions. One, how does it actually work? And then secondly, it's been around a long time. What's the future?
Yeah, so the Iron Dome system, it's used by Israel. It's been very, very effective at shooting down artillery rounds and rockets that have been fired by Hamas into Israel. It's worth pointing out that most of these rockets and artillery rounds are not very well aimed, and if they're not going to hit the urban environment, then they're not shot out of the sky. So the Iron Dome system has been very good. It was first put into service in 2011, and it's very good. It's got 3 sections. It's got a radar that obviously continuously tracks this stuff. It's got a computer that decides when it does track something, is it going to land somewhere in a populated area or not? And if it is going to land in a populated area, then it actually is a missile fire unit, and each of those units carries about 20 missiles, understand. There's 3 or 4 of those per Iron Dome system. And the Iron Dome system, when it's deployed, covers about 50 square miles. So it's quite a capable system.
So they have a number of them scattered around the place to create the coverage.
Absolutely right. They don't have to cover the whole of the country because obviously you can position them a bit closer to the border. But both Hezbollah to the north and also Hamas to the west have also been using these missiles. The challenge, of course, is that apparently each of those missiles, it costs about $70,000 per engagement. So when Hamas have got 30,000 rockets, maybe more, Hezbollah apparently got 100,000 rockets, maybe more. You do the maths, that's really difficult. And I think that's why America put about $1.6 billion into this program between 2011, I think it was, and 2020. And in 2022, they gave another $1 billion to the program. But it is quite expensive. But so far, what price do you put on protecting people? It is expensive, but it has proved remarkably effective.
And there's, if my memory serves me right, 50 odd in each Iron Dome system, or
well, I think it's 20 missiles, and there's 3 of them, so 60 missiles per unit. So one of the things that you can overwhelm it is if they fire so many rockets. The trouble is, if they fire lots of rockets, not all of them are going to land on in the urban environment. And if they're not a risk, then Israel doesn't intercept them. It saves its intercept for those.
If you get a lot of rockets coming over from Hamas, and sometimes they've sent hundreds at a time.
Yes.
And you've got to fire off the whole lot. That's over $4 million.
It's ridiculous amount of money, but
that's just one.
What price protection?
Yeah.
As for the future, turning to your point about the future, there has been talk about, it's been around now for 15 years, old technology. Why not use lasers? Because not only laser travel at the speed of light, so it's really quick at taking out a threat. Once you've got the system, that belt of laser energy, it's less than £1 per shot.
Can we actually generate that much power in a laser beam?
Yeah. And there's all sorts of investment being done. There was something in the news literally a couple of weeks ago about us testing some stuff in one of the ranges about laser weapons. And going back to 40 years ago, they were looking at lasers in space to take out satellite. These have been around for a long time. Part of the challenge with lasers, though, is the laser is very dependent on air conditions. So if you were in a foggy day, the laser gets dispersed immediately by the water. Well, Iron Dome is all weather. Doesn't matter what the weather is, it can take out those stuff. So
you might still need a sort of backup if you're...
Yeah, and they are a bit slower. That if you've got 40 rockets coming in, the laser can only work at one at a time, because obviously it's got to point at it, melt it, do whatever it does to it, and then move on to the next one. So unlike a missile system where you can send lots of missiles up together, so it looks certain as if lasers will come, but it looks like it'll be a complementary system with a lot cheaper to fire individually. But if you do get a mass attack, you're going to have the Iron Dome system to help out.